10 minutes past 8, and we have Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International. Good morning, Dr. John.
Yeah, good morning, Mick.
It's great to have you back again after the long weekend, Dr. John. And, exciting times. Hey, you've got a website, creation.com. That's Creation Ministries. It's all part of the same thing. Creation.com, of course, has answers to all sorts of amazing questions. Anything to do with creation, evolution, dinosaurs, aliens, all those sorts of things. But, of course, Dr. John is answering your questions on air, because if you have a question, chances are other people have the same question. And we'd love you to send your questions through to our text line, and that is 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, over the last few weeks we've been speaking a lot about dinosaurs, last week in particular, and we had a question that came in last week, sort of straight after the dinosaur talk, and the question was in regards to, dinosaurs not actually existing. And do you have much to say about that? They were saying, dinosaurs are pretty much just a creation of man, and all the dinosaurs we see in museums, well, they're just moulds, and they're not really, real.
Look, that's been something that a lot of Christian people have tried to say over the years, and one of the reasons is that they find it so hard to fit dinosaurs into the picture of the Bible, because the Bible very clearly tells us that we are a creation, and that death only came into the world through man's sin. Now, of course, when you read what the world says about dinosaurs, there's supposedly this age of dinosaurs well over 100 million years ago, and they all died out supposedly 65 million years ago, and clearly that was before people came on the scene as far as the world's concerned. So how do you explain it if there was no death before sin? And, of course, people have come up with explanations like that no such thing as genuine dinosaur bones, and they're plaster models and all of this sort of stuff. And, of course, a lot of the museum specimens, the big skeletons that you see in the Smithsonian and the Natural History Museum in New York, I was there only last year, and most of those skeletons are made up of plaster casts of bones, but there are genuine bones there. And unless you understand what the Bible is really saying, you do get into that sort of tangle. And we got onto dinosaurs because we'd had another question from a listener who'd said he'd been listening to a Q&A session by a Christian pastor who clearly didn't take the biblical view, was asked a question about dinosaurs and got into all sorts of tangles. Yeah. And you're always going to get into those tangles if you don't see that the world's time frame and the world's belief in evolution is a lie and a fabrication. You will always get into a tangle if you don't believe that. You can't have a foot in both camps. You've got to come down on one side or the other. And what I've found is that if you decide that you are going to come down on the biblical side, everything, all the scientific evidence absolutely fits into place.
Yeah. So the bottom line is there are actually dinosaur bones, real dinosaur bones that have been found. I guess for them to find that living flesh in one of the bones, there must have been a real bone to find it in.
Yeah, of course, that's true. They've found collagen fibers, DNA sequences, even red blood cells in dinosaur bones. And we need to remember that one of the other discoveries in recent times, and we've talked about this on the program, was the discovery of bone cells that look very fresh in a Triceratops horn. Now, the guy who found that was a Christian and a creationist, and the moment he published his findings, his university sacked him. And he had to charge them with wrongful dismissal on the grounds of his religious beliefs, and he, in fact, won the case. But he most certainly wasn't fabricating the fact that he found genuine bone cells in a genuine Triceratops horn. So they definitely do exist. There's no question about it.
Wow, okay. Well, look, when we come back after the break, we might have to ask a question that came in more recently. Does the Bible talk about dinosaurs? Dr. John, thank you for that. It is 15 minutes past 8, and you're on 94 Points Morning. It is 19 minutes past 8, and we have Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International. And Dr. John's been talking to us about dinosaurs. Lots of people with so many questions about dinosaurs. And one of them, Dr. John, they were talking about, they've asked, does the Bible actually talk about dinosaurs?
Yes, well, look, Mick, one of the things that I've found is that Christians will always get into a state of confusion if they don't believe what the Bible says, because when you do believe exactly what it says, then everything makes sense. And I'll just try and put it into its biblical perspective, and people will see that it does make sense. You see, dinosaurs were created on day 6 along with all the other land animals and man. And all of those animals, even the carnivores, were originally created vegetarian.
Yep.
But the entry of sin corrupted everything. And that first world eventually became so violent, wicked and corrupted that God had to destroy it. And he did that by Noah's global flood. Mm-hmm. And of humanity, only Noah's extended family was preserved. They were the only ones who survived, along with pairs of each kind of land-dwelling, air-breathing animal. Now, I emphasize kinds, not species. Mm-hmm. And when we talk about kinds, we talk about things like the cat kind, the dog kind, the horse kind, that sort of thing, not all the various species of big cats. Okay?
Yep.
So it's kinds, not species. Now, we need to remember, too, that total destruction of all of those animals, apart from the ones on the ark, it didn't extend to sea creatures. But obviously, because it was a global flood, a lot of those sea creatures got caught up in it, and so they are buried along with the land animals and dinosaurs. And that's where the fossils came from. That's why we find so many fossils all over the place, because of Noah's flood. Now, we just don't see fossilization occurring today. If it does occur, it's got to be a very, very, very rare event. So how do you explain all of those fossils all over the world? Mm-hmm. And Noah's flood is the obvious explanation. Now, it follows that means some dinosaurs survived the flood. So therefore, you would expect to find a mention of them in history living alongside people. Mm-hmm. Now, your question that you asked before was, does the Bible mention dinosaurs?
Yep.
Yes, it does. The book of Job mentions a couple of very large creatures that we would understand to be dinosaurs. But we need to remember that the word dinosaur, and we've mentioned this many times before, it's a relatively new word in the English language. Mm-hmm. It was only made up in about 1840. And before that, all the fossils that were being found were called dragon fossils. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Bible does mention dragons, and it mentions those two great creatures in the book of Job. And there's an enormous amount of descriptive evidence of dragons in human literature from all over the world, especially in Europe. Now, the Vikings and the Saxons, they were all very familiar with dragons. The English and the Welsh were very familiar with them. The Welsh national flag even has a dragon on it. That's everybody who comes from Wales is very, very familiar with their national flag.
Yeah.
And if you think about right over on the other side of the world, with no connection with the Welsh, the Chinese are very familiar with dragons as well, and they have named one of the years in their calendar after dragons. So no connection between the Welsh and the Chinese. Why would they both come up with the same creature if it was mythical? Doesn't make sense.
Absolutely. You are on 94.9 this morning. It's 23 minutes past 8. And if you have a question for Dr. John, please send it through to our text line 0401 949 949. Now, we've got Dr. John on the line from Creation Ministries International, who has been answering your questions that get sent through to our text line, 0401 949 949. And another question that we had come in, Dr. John, I remember last week you talking about, dinosaurs not eating meat before, basically before the flood, I think you said. Was that right?
No, before the fall.
Before the fall.
I'm sure they were eating meat very well and truly just after the fall.
Yes, okay, then, well, before the fall. And a question came in from a young man called Josiah, who lives in Sydney, and he asked if all the created animals were originally herbivores, why, for example, did God create lions with sharp teeth? Could you address that one for us, Dr. John?
Yeah, interesting one, isn't it? And it's a question that you do hear. Thanks, Josiah, for asking that one. But the truth is, you can't tell the diet of an animal by its teeth. Mm-hmm. Now, admittedly, lions' teeth now are used for tearing flesh, but they don't have to tear flesh. And in the war, a lot of the lions in the zoos in England did perfectly well on vegetables. And there's no doubt that animals, even with very sharp teeth, do eat only vegetables. One good example is the panda. Yep. Now, the panda is a genuine bear, but unlike other bears, it only eats bamboo. Yep. And its teeth are designed for ripping into bamboo. The other classic example we have here in Australia is if you found a skull out in the wild and it had very sharp teeth, you might think it was a fox skull, and it could be, but it could also be a bat, because remember, our fruit bats are called flying foxes. Mm-hmm. And they're called that because they've got a head and teeth just like a fox. But they don't eat meat, they only eat fruit. So there you go. You see, you can't necessarily tell the diet of an animal by looking at its teeth.
Absolutely.
So really, that's the answer, Josiah. The Bible does tell us that we were all created vegetarian, and carnivory would only have come in after the fall, after sin entered the world and everything became corrupted. Remember that when we get down to the time just before the flood, the Bible says that all flesh had corrupted its way on the earth. The earth was filled with violence. Every intent of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually. It must have been a very, very horrible world that God was forced to destroy with Noah's flood.
Absolutely. And look, I know all about possums. I've been bitten by one of them before as well, trying to feed him something. And they've got some of the sharpest teeth I know of. Yeah. And look, they're cute little things. Just be very careful if you get close to their mouth. Hey, we've got the weather and traffic coming up very shortly. Don't forget, you can send your questions through to Dr. John on 0401 949 949. That is our text line number, com website as well. Look, if you have any questions, feel free to send them through to us, though, because if you have a question, of course, many others may have the same question. The text line is 0401 949 949. Now, Dr. John, we also had a question come through this morning. It said, thank you for the marvellous job you do through Rhema. I love your articles on Creation Ministry. My question today is the following. How can we explain to non-believers that the world was populated only through Adam and Eve and their sons Abel and Cain?
Yeah, very, very good question, Mick, because Abel and Cain, of course, are the only two progeny of Adam and Eve, apart from Seth, that are mentioned, and they're all male. So it's a very interesting question. The answers are there in the Bible, but it's a long answer, and I think we'll deal with that next week because it's going to take too long to deal with it this morning.
Certainly.
Because there's another thing that I really feel a need to talk about today, and this is, of course, what has displaced even coronavirus from the news. And that is the Black Lives Matter demonstrations all over the world. I mean, not just in America, but all over Europe, the UK, and here in Australia.
Yes.
And I want to have a look at that, because I want to talk about how the issue of racism is intricately bound up with evolution. And all Christians really do need to be aware of the evolutionary connection with racism. Now, I mean, we've all been appalled by what happened to George Floyd, and we've seen all these protests all over the world, and it's a shame that the peaceful protests, and there have been plenty of those, have unfortunately been accompanied by rioting, looting, vandalism and things like that, because that clouds the issue. And unfortunately, they're the sorts of things, the violence that the media tends to focus on, rather than the very legitimate protests that people have been demonstrating about. And it's been a blessing that here in Australia the protests have been pretty much non-violent. But look, we really need to have a look at racism itself and the modern connection, the modern racism, with evolution. Now, certainly, of course, we can't blame belief in evolution for racism. Racism's always been around. There's nothing new about it. It's been present right throughout history. Whenever one ethnic group had the power to oppress another, we see that happening throughout history. I mean, the classic example, I suppose, is the example of the Bible with the Israelites in Egypt. Now, as we know, they went down to Egypt, and Joseph was the governor of Egypt, and he saved the whole world because of the famine that had occurred at that time. And the Israelites then stayed in Egypt, and they had the best of land to dwell in, and they populated greatly. But of course, many years after Joseph died, there was a regime change, and what happened then was that the new regime didn't know what had happened in the past, or didn't take any notice of that, and they started to oppress the Israelites because they were numerically stronger. The Israelites were then pressed into slavery, and they were only delivered via Moses. So, you know, that's probably the first biblical example that we see. And we've seen it right throughout all history. The stronger and the more numerous oppress the weaker and the less numerous. And it still happens today all over the world. And clearly it happened in America before slavery was abolished, but the racist mindset still exists. And it was also the case here in Australia in the early days. But then something happened, and that's what I want to talk about when we come back.
Absolutely. We're with Dr. John from Creation Ministries International. It is 17 minutes to 9. If you have a question, send it through to the text line 0401 949. And we have Dr. John on the line, Dr. John from Creation Ministries International, who's been talking to us a little bit this morning about dinosaurs, and then a little bit more about the just now about the Black Lives Matter and racism. I mean, we've seen the slave trader Edward Colston, his statue over in the UK, being rolled into the ocean or into Bristol Harbour. And, there's stuff going on all over the world at the moment. It's sort of a bit of a blow-up in recent news, racism, or speaking out about racism all over the world. And Dr. John, you were just talking about Darwin and publications that he's sort of created, and how that's changed things.
Yes, it has, Mick. As we said, racism's always been with us, and there's no way that you can blame Darwin for starting it. But he really did give it a boost, and this is what I meant when I said something happened that really gave racism a boost. And that was the publication of Darwin's book on evolution called The Origin of Species, because that book actually had a subtitle. And the subtitle was The Preservation of the Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, the problem is that Darwin believed, and he taught, that the darker-skinned ethnic groups were less evolved than the white Europeans. And, of course, he was one of them. So why wouldn't he believe that? Because he believed in evolution. And that's what he taught. And he taught that the darker-skinned groups were closer to or less evolved than the white Europeans, and that by extension they were closer to our most common ancestor with the apes. Now, that's what Darwin believed, and that's what he taught. And what that did was it gave racism, which was already there, a pseudo-scientific foundation, because Darwin said it's part of the natural events of life because of evolution. Now, that really gave racism in Australia a boost as well. Certainly there was a lot of oppression of the Aboriginal people in the early days anyway, but it got very much worse in the late 19th century after Darwin's book was published. And you don't hear too much about it these days, but some of the terrible things happened in our history of Aboriginal people being hunted down and murdered for body parts, because the European museums that were believing what Darwin taught were demanding specimens and samples because it was believed that the Aboriginal people were some sort of missing link. So terrible things happened in Australia, and like I say, you don't hear too much about that these days. The other thing that grew out of Darwin's beliefs was eugenics. Now, eugenics, or sterilisation of the unfit, stopping the unfit breeding, that was promulgated by Darwin's first cousin, a guy called Francis Galton. Now, it wasn't very big in Australia, but it was in Europe and America. And multiple thousands of the supposed unfit were sterilised and prevented from breeding, people with mental illness and so on. It was really terrible, and it really only finished in the latter half of the 20th century. I mean, we're not talking about very long ago. So, and it was taken to its worst extreme by Hitler. You remember, Hitler believed in the master race, and he believed that his tall, blonde, blue-eyed Nazi soldiers, they were the most evolved people on the planet. And he wanted to see all the best women impregnated by his Nazi soldiers. And he didn't just persecute the Jews. He executed people with mental illness as well. So Hitler, he was a great believer in Darwin's principles, and he took it to its extreme. So where does that leave us today in the Western world? And why should Christians be aware of this? Well, remember that every child in the Western world now is taught that Darwin was right and evolution is true.
Yes, absolutely. Wow, interesting talk this morning. If you do have any questions, send them through to us. Of course, our text line number 0401 949 949. You're with Mick and Dr. John from Creation Ministries International on 94.9 at 7 minutes to 9, the world. And, very interesting chat this morning, Dr. John.
Yes, Mick, and as I've said, Christians need to be aware of the connection between modern racism and belief in Darwin's evolution and the fact that everybody is taught it. And what we find now is that there's a lot of examples of racism in sport, in European soccer, the black players are abused by monkey chants and getting bananas thrown at them. And we had that famous example only a couple of years ago here in AFL football in Australia, when Adam Goods, who was a wonderful Indigenous player for the Sydney Swans, dual Brownlow medalist, he got called an ape. And so many people saw that footage on the TV. And it was a young girl who had directed that insult at him. Now, the interesting thing is that if one of the white players were called an ape, that would only be an insult. But when it's directed at one of the Indigenous players, it's called racist. Now, isn't that an interesting distinction? That on the one hand it's an insult, on the other hand it's racist, and it all goes back to Darwinian evolutionary belief. Now, next week we've got that question about our descent from Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and we're going to talk about the Christian's perfect answer, the biblical answer to racism. And that's going to be an interesting one for next week.
Yes, absolutely. Well, that was very interesting this week too, Dr. John. Really appreciate it. It's been absolutely awesome.
Okay, well, tell everybody to be tuned for next week, because we'll show that we really are the one human family, and that racism has absolutely no basis whatsoever. We all, our skin colour makes not the slightest difference to the fact that we are all part of the human race.
Absolutely. And of course, Dr. John would know. He was a medical practitioner, so he really does know what's inside, underneath that skin deep colour, which makes hardly any difference at all, apart from just that skin deep colour. You are on 94.9 this morning. It is 8:59. We've got the news and weather coming up next. And you will be back with Dr. John next week. Don't forget, send your questions through to our text line. It is 0401 949 949. You are on 94.9 this morning.